Hi, this is Dr. Redkay, and we are going to review validity threats for 710 research methods. Can you see, you can see the threats to internal and external validity? You can see the module? Okay. All right. So there are really 4 textbooks that guide this section, this module. And you didn't have to buy any of those. I've sort of copied the chapters that I thought were the most critical and most important. And so that's kind of how this section is divided. So the first one here is Morling. It's actually a psychology textbook, which I think is wonderful. And the 3 things that we get from Morling are what's called the 3 claims. And she describes basically the different types of research that are out there. So quantitative research. So the first one is frequency. So some percent of people do Y or RY. So it's observational studies. So 3% of the American population are, whatever, sexual offenders, something along those lines. Okay. Association. X is associated with Y. LGBT people are significantly more likely to be depressed and anxious. Okay. It is blank associated with blank. It is not causal. It is simply associated. So the example here is when ice cream sales increase, drownings increase. That does not mean that ice cream causes drowning. The factor is actually just warmer weather causes more people to swim, which causes more people to drown. So this is what is most often referred to as correlation, not causation. So the causal claim is causation. That's when we can say blank changes blank, X changes Y, CBT significantly reduces depression. Okay, those are the 3 claims. And then this really goes into helping students understand the difference between, again, evidence, research, or their beliefs, their opinions, right? And they talk about the difference between conspiracy theories and scientific reasoning. One of the powers behind a conspiracy theory is that it's not falsifiable. You can't prove it's not true. So if I, believe that if I put a tinfoil hat on my head and I hide in the basement, aliens can't read my mind, and that's my belief, you can't tell me anything to change that. If you prove to me conclusively it's not true, I'm going to say, no, the aliens have already gotten to you. That's why you think this, right? So that is the idea of falsifiability. You have to be able to falsify something, meaning prove that it's not true. Okay, prove that it's not accurate. Also, just the idea of like accepting research as evidence. Then of course, there's this thing called confirmation bias. I didn't use this term, but I've talked to some of you about it with your research studies. Like if you want to be the researcher, it's not a good idea for you also to be the person who leads the intervention because you want your intervention to work. So as you're assessing it, you have a confirmation bias, like I think it's going to work, so therefore I see it working, right? The other thing too is to think about this idea that research results are what's called probabilistic. It's about probability. So something you should know, particularly for quantitative research, is that typically statistics are involved. And then how do you know if it was effective or not? How do I know that CBT significantly reduced depression? The word significant is really only used when you've done math, when you've done statistics. So it is mathematically significant. That's what it means. And what does that mean, mathematically significant? What it means is that you have this p-value, which stands for the probability that the results are accurate. The threshold for p-value is 0.05. Think of it like a nickel. So if the p-value is 0.05, what that means is that the researchers think that there is a 5% chance that a mistake could have happened. in the research and the results are not accurate, that there was a mistake made somewhere. And the flip side is we are 95% confident that it is accurate. Okay. If the p-value is 0.01, then we are 99% confident that it's correct. And 1%, there's a 1% chance that it's incorrect. Does anybody have any questions on the p-value? Okay, so the example is if Consumer Reports indicates that a Toyota Camry hybrid is a great car and it has very little issues, you happen to buy the car and it has way more issues than what Consumer Reports predicted. So then the question is Consumer Reports wrong? Is Consumer Reports bad or unreliable because you bought the car? And the answer is no, it's not bad because it's based on probability, right? That Consumer Reports, like I said, like p-values, is they are 95% confident that Toyota Camrys are a great car, or they could say 99% of Toyota Camrys are a great car free of most major issues, right? Just because you pick out one that has a problem, it doesn't mean that Toyota Camrys in general are bad, and it doesn't mean that Consumer Reports is bad. That is what we call an anomaly. In research, you will hear people often say, that's not evidence, that's just an anomaly. It's a one-time thing that might have happened to you or to someone you know. A popular example of this is, I don't know if you remember when the COVID vaccine came out, there was some famous rapper, I can't remember who it was. Was it Nicki Minaj? And it was like her cousin or something that she claimed her cousin, it was something to do with his private parts, like he took the COVID vaccine and he reported something happened. And then she was like, I'm not going to take this because look at this side effect. But none of it ended up being true. But even if it was true, it would be an anomaly. It only happened to one person. Okay, so when we think about research, we prove nothing and everything is probabilistic. Okay, so it is more likely to be true. Okay, so now it's the 4 validities. Okay, so there's internal validity, which means inside the research study. Were the methods good? Were the methods good? Then there's external validity. What that means is, can we say that these results apply to other people, right? I'll give you an example. So CBT therapy is effective with white folks. It is less effective with Latinos. So if I do a study with white folks to say CBT was effective with these white folks, it is not generalizable to other races because I only studied white folks. Okay, if I study Latinos and I find that CBT is not effective with Latinos, that doesn't necessarily apply to other races. It only applies to the people in that study. Now, if we did a better study where we randomized participants, which is very difficult in our field, if we did that, then we could say this does apply to other people. That's external validity. Then we have statistical validity. We could do the statistics and the math and we get a great p-value, but it has a low effect size, which means, yes, it is significant, but is it big enough? So with significant, sometimes you can fake significance. If you have a large enough population, like if you have 30,000 people in your database, it could be significant just because you have so many people, but it doesn't mean it actually had a real impact. And that's where you get into things like effect size or power, correlation coefficient. There's a bunch of other sort of statistical things that you look at to determine how it increases the credibility of the research. Okay, then we have construct validity. That is your measurement tool. Again, all of this is quantitative. So is your measurement tool validated or not? And that's not a feeling, because I'll ask people, is your measurement tool validated? I feel like it is. No, it's not. There, it is or it isn't. There's a research study where they did very complicated math and validated it. Now, when we say it's validated, that means you can use it with different populations, okay? I'll give you an example. I had a legal case recently. I'm arguing with a psychiatrist so they had a child take the PHQ-9. Does anybody know anything about the PHQ-9? Who's that validated for?
Adults.
Adults, not for children, but they gave it to a child. There are 3 questions that are different, which can swing the results by 9 points, which could result in the person being severely depressed or only moderately depressed. That makes a difference. The kid went on and died by suicide. It makes a difference. So if a measurement tool is validated for adults, you give it to adults. If it's validated for children, you give it to children, right? You only use it for the population that it's validated for. Some tools are wonderful, like the PHQ-9 is wonderful. You can give it to any adult, any race, because it hasn't been shown to not be effective with certain races. You could, if you did more studies, you might find that it's not effective, but so far the research shows that it is, that it's appropriate. Okay, so those are the 4 validities, and you should know a little bit more about those validities. You need 3 things to determine a causal relationship. You need 3 things in a research study to determine if one thing impacted the other. 1, they have to be correlated, right? So when CBT happens, depression goes down. So sometimes correlation can, it's either an inverse relationship or a same directional relationship. CBT goes up, happiness goes up, right? CBT goes up, sadness or depression goes down, right? So that is correlated. When one thing happens, another thing changes. Temporal precedence. This is number 2. Temporal precedence mean one thing has to happen before the other. Okay, so you measure depression, they're depressed, then you give them CBT, then depression changes. So the CBT had to come before the depression change. That makes sense. Temporal precedence. The CBT, the intervention, the thing that fixes the other thing came before the thing that's fixed. The last thing is internal validity, right? It had to be a good study. You have to have a good study. Okay, so all of that came from the Moorling textbook. That's textbook 1. We have 3 more to go. Okay, if you have questions, stop and just ask me, okay? There are 4 types of research. This is the Angle and Schutt text. There's descriptive, where you describe things, like you observe what percentage of the Lancaster population are homeless, or what percentage of the homeless population came from child welfare? What's the percentage of the homeless population that's LGBT? Okay, that is all descriptive. Then you have exploratory research. This is more likely the qualitative element. There is something that we don't yet know and we want to explore it. We want to know, like an example would be, say, you have, let's say 50% of your clients stopped attending your treatment program. Well, you want to figure out why. So you explore, you have qualitative interviews with them, and you ask them why they all dropped out. You discover that a daycare center nearby closed. So now they have no childcare. So it had nothing to do with them wanting to be sober or less depressed, or your program was good or bad. It was simply the daycare program closed, right? That is exploratory. You don't know what the answer is. You're trying to figure it out. That's qualitative. Then you have explanatory research. That is where we want to explain, CBT increased or decreased depression, right? We want to understand the causes of homelessness. Okay, so then we have evaluation research or program evaluation, and that is really, that's more about the a model or a program. So independent living. Did independent living prevent homelessness? Did this program? So we're evaluating the program, okay? Then we get into different types of validity. There is measurement validity and internal validity. We talked a little bit about that earlier. This explains it in a little bit more detail, and I'll let you read that. We also discussed about causation, and causation, I'll let you read more about that, but it's the same thing, that one thing causes the other. This is just sort of this author's version of it. And then again, they talk about the causal relationship, and they distinguish between a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study, again, is descriptive and it is observational. Cross-sectional is it happens at one point in time, okay? Whereas a longitudinal study examines things over time. So the CBT reduces depression study, that's longitudinal. What percentage of the population that's homeless in Lancaster is either, you know, from the child welfare system or LGBT? That is cross-sectional. I want to measure today, where are people? Like, who are the people that are homeless in Lancaster? Okay. Again, a little bit more about validity here. We did talk about the statistical validity, and I said there's like correlation coefficients, there's effect size. Well, this is power. They talk about power, sampling error, also doing the wrong statistics for the study. This is another version of the 4 types of internal validity, or the 4 types of validity: internal, external, statistical, conclusion, and construct. You can read more about what the different authors say. I find that I may read one author and it makes a lot of sense, and then I read a different author and I'm completely confused about the same concept. So it's like you read them and see which one works for you. The big thing is threats to internal validity. That is one of the things that you really need to know when you go to the next classes. Okay. Okay, so here are the threats. Now, this is Campbell and Stanley. There's a threat of history. And what that is that something happens between, here they say the first and second measurements, right? So, you know, you measure for depression, you do a CBT intervention, you measure for depression a second time. Before you measure the second time and after you measure the first time, obviously CBT happens, but something else happens. Imagine they won the lottery, okay? Now they're no longer depressed. This is the threat. It's an internal validity threat, and it's called history. There are, and then this right here in the module, it says control. What that means is, how do you fix it? If you are concerned about a history threat, you fix it by making sure that the experimental and control groups are measured at the same time. Okay, that's a way. So if something happened to the group, it happens to them together, and that's a way that you can control that problem. Maturation. This is similar, but it means sort of like a natural change in time, a natural change. An example of this is like maybe a seasonal change. You're depressed in winter, but you're less depressed in summer, right? And it's not because you had CBT the whole time, it's just the weather got better. So maturation, or people get older, you know, or they're tired, right? So they score differently. Sometimes testing, there's a testing internal threat. What that is some agencies, with one of the legal cases I worked, the case that the kid went on to die by suicide, every time they saw him, they gave him a depression and a suicide screening. Well, at some point, he's going to get sick of it, and he's not going to really answer the questions honestly. He's going to be like, whatever, circle, circle, circle. I say I'm depressed. I don't say I'm depressed. You do nothing about it. So why am I answering these, right? So that is the threat of testing. If you over test people, you get poor results. Then we have instrumentation. That basically means your measurement tool isn't valid or it's not good. That's when people want to make up their own questions, right? You shouldn't make up your own questions. You should use a validated tool. That does not apply to qualitative people, though. It's a different situation. You have a different way of producing good questions. Statistical regression. This is a difficult concept, but it just basically means like, okay, if you're studying people who have severe alcohol use disorder versus mild, you're picking a group because of the extreme issue. Well, if, at some point you will observe differences because of those differences. But there's also one of the things where it says regress to the mean. What that means is if you study too many people, like if you have 30,000 people, the results will regress to the mean, meaning everybody's going to be average. You're not going to really be able to understand the results of the study. They won't be revealed because they'll be covered up with these other things. Biases. So that means unequal groups, right? So an example could be the experimental group is people with severe alcohol use disorder, and then the control group is people with mild alcohol use disorder. The groups there's a bias there, there's an imbalance, they're not equal. The control for that is randomization. If you randomize the participants, then the groups are balanced. Experimental mortality. So what that means is there is a difference in the groups because people dropped out of the experimental group. So let's say an example, let's do substance use again. The experimental group is people are, running every day, 5, 10, 15 miles. That's the experiment to try to get those people sober. The control group is people receiving massages. Okay. So then the experimental group people keep dropping out because nobody wants to run 15 miles, but the control group people stay in. That is experimental mortality. People drop out of the experiment because they're frustrated for some reason. And then that creates an unbalanced groups. It creates an unbalanced comparison groups. Then you can't really compare those groups anymore because now they're different. The last threat to internal validity is what's called selection, maturation, interaction. That would be when you put people in different groups based on their likelihood of getting better. So the example here is participants have a lower IQ, so you put them in the control group because you think they won't understand CBT. Okay. Now we have threats to external validity. Does anybody have any questions about the internal threats or threats to internal validity? Okay, external validity. Reactive or interaction effects of testing. Okay, so this is what you might know as the Hawthorne effect. When participants know they're being observed or measured, their behavior changes. Okay. And the idea, the way to control that is to add a control group, right? You can't just have the measurement group. Are you guys familiar with the Hawthorne effect, or do you want me to explain it? Hello?
Yeah, we talked about it in leadership.
This need to be refreshed for a second. It was because people were told to do something. Because there was authority involved.
So what it was is there was a gentleman who was researching work behavior in a factory. He wanted to sort of increase productivity. Okay. So he came into the factory and, was observing people taking notes. And what he discovered is their productivity went up simply because he was there. So he thought at first that he brightened the lights and he thought, oh, they're more productive, let's brighten all the lights. But at some point they stopped being productive, and he kept doing things and realized it was really simply his presence that made the difference. And so that is the Hawthorne effect. When people know they're being observed, his name was Hawthorne, then they change their productivity, or they respond differently, but it's not based on the intervention. Okay. So you add a control group, and then you can see if there was actually a change or not. Then there's interaction effects of selection bias. So this is similar to what we talked about before, but people who are more depressed were selected for the experimental group because they needed help. The way that you control that is you randomize the participants. People in the control group and the experimental group should be equal. There's reactive effects. So let's say people are in a DBT therapy group, but they have read every book that Marsha Linehan has written. They watch videos of it, so they know all about DBT before they get into the intervention. Then we can't really say that intervention made a difference because they already were exposed to these things before. The control for that is to eliminate extraneous variables. You could prevent participants by Googling, you can keep them in a controlled environment, but it is unrealistic for the type of research that we do. That's very challenging. Multiple treatment interference, that's prior treatment. So the last one was they have knowledge of the intervention. This is they've had prior treatment. This also will come into play when you are trying to, let's say if you're doing CBT for depression again, let's say that some of the people in the group started medication. That's an interference. So is it the medication that made those folks better or the CBT? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here. Stop the recording.